Nadine here. So, today we're going to be listening to, um, let's see here, Mr. Tilly's Seance and Beyond the Wall of Sleep. So that looks like it's going to be, uh, kind of fun. Yeah, I know. This is kind of a makeup screen because my computer kind of conked out and I just said screw it and wiped the whole thing, set it up again. Hi, honey. And I set it all up again, and it actually went really smooth this time. So I but I had rescheduled it for tonight because yesterday I had been busy. So I was driving in fog and running my landlady to the or picking my landlady up to the from the airport. So I had to nap in the evening. So, but I'm glad you can make it. Yeah, I know Faye went up. I didn't notice that until today that she was going up now. But hey, that's okay. Um, it is what it is. Mm. And hugs for everybody, because I've got more new lighting come in, and I'm gonna get started back into doing the actual my hands going on shortly. Um, I've been making a cover for my back so that it's not so cold when I'm actually up and about. Yeah, that's funny. Well, we're just listening to a couple of books, so I'm glad to have you around and you know, and that. So, but I'm gonna be working. Oops, wiggle camera. Excuse me, I'm gonna be working on my website. Did I have drinks? I've got drink. I got drink, so we're all good. And and I don't know. Do you know Brian Josiah is gonna be coming to visit me shortly? Hopefully, hopefully, honey. And it's less than 6 days now, so I'm so excited. Mm, yay! Mm, what do you do? It's like yay! Yeah, Josiah's coming to visit me in just a few days, or at least we'll see what happens. Flights booked and all that kind of fun stuff. So I'm so happy. I have to tell everybody. um, yeah, so that's what's going on. But I'm working on my website right now, um, and trying to figure out how to do the blog up. And so working on the template for the darn thing, and working on the CSS code, and we'll see how that goes. Yay! Okay, so let's have a go at it. And oh, excuse me. There we go. Okay, I'm assuming that I've been coming through okay. I'm switching back and forth, so if like I've got different workspaces that I'm going to, you can't see at that part of the screen because my banner's covering it. I didn't notice that, but it kind of works because I don't want anybody really seeing all the links and stuff that I'm going to when I do it this way, so that kind of works. Um, But if you can't see what's going on, let me know. Oh, my camera's kind of tilted the wrong way. There we go. I think my screen ended up moving a bit. There we go. And down a bit. Yay. Okay, that's better. Good enough. I was actually really happy I was able to get everything to restore and back up properly and stuff like that, so it didn't take me long to get this running. So, yay. Oh, excuse me, I got the yawns. So we're going to unmute myself and we're going to listen to the first book, which is Mr. Tilly's Seance by E.F. Benson. Ooh.
Mr. Tilly's Seance by E.F. Benson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Lewis Richardson. Mr. Tilly's Seance by E.F. Benson. Mr. Tilly had only the briefest moment for reflection when, as he slipped and fell on the greasy wood pavement at Hyde Park Corner, which he was crossing at a smart trot, he saw the huge traction engine, with its grooved ponderous wheels, towering high above him. Oh dear, he said petulantly. It will certainly crush me quite flat, and I shan't be able to be at Mrs. Cumberbatch's séance. Most provoking. Ow! The words were hardly out of his mouth when the first half of his horrid anticipations was thoroughly fulfilled. The heavy wheels passed over him from head to foot and flattened him completely out. Then the driver, too late, reversed his engine and passed over him again, and finally lost his head, whistled loudly, and stopped. The policeman on duty at the corner turned quite faint at the sight of the catastrophe, but presently recovered sufficiently to hold up the traffic and ran to see what on earth could be done. It was all so much up with Mr. Tilly that the only possible thing was to get the hysterical engine driver to move clear. Then the ambulance from the hospital was sent for, and Mr. Tilly's remains, detached with great difficulty from the road, so firmly had they been pressed into it, were reverently carried away to the mortuary. Mr. Tilly during this had experienced one moment's excruciating pain, resembling the severest neuralgia, as his head was ground beneath the wheel. But almost before he realized it, the pain was past, and he found himself, still rather dazed, floating or standing, he did not know which, in the middle of the road. There had been no break in his consciousness. He perfectly recollected slipping, and wondered how he had managed to save himself. He saw the arrested traffic, the policeman with white wan face making suggestions to the gibbering engine driver, and he received the very puzzling impression that the traction engine was all mixed up with him. He had a sensation of red-hot coals and boiling water and rivets all around him, but yet no feeling of scalding or burning or confinement. He was, on the contrary, extremely comfortable, and had the most pleasant consciousness of buoyancy and freedom. Then the engine puffed, and the wheels went round, and immediately, to his immense surprise, he perceived his own crushed remains, flat as a biscuit, lying on the roadway. He identified them for certain by his clothes, which he had put on for the first time that morning, and one patent leather boot, which had escaped demolition. "But what on earth has happened?" he said. "Here am I, and yet that poor pressed flower of arms and legs is me, or rather I also. And how terribly upset the driver looks. Why, I do believe that I've been run over. It did hurt for a moment, now I come to think of it. My good man, where are you shoving to? Don't you see me?" He addressed these two questions to the policeman, who appeared to walk right through him. But the man took no notice and calmly came out on the other side. It was quite evident that he did not see him or apprehend him in any way. Mr. Tilly was still feeling rather at sea amid these unusual occurrences, and there began to steal into his mind a glimpse of the fact, which was so obvious to the crowd, which formed an interested but respectful ring around his body. Men stood with bared heads, women screamed and looked away, and then looked back again. "I really believe I'm dead," said he, That's the only hypothesis which will cover the facts. But I must feel more certain of it before I do anything. Ah, here they come with the ambulance to look at me. I must be terribly hurt. And yet I don't feel hurt. I should feel hurt, surely, if I was hurt. I must be dead. Certainly it seemed the only thing for him to be. But he was far from realizing it yet. A lane had been made through the crowd for the stretcher-bearers, and he found himself wincing when they began to detach him from the road. "Oh, do take care," he said. "That's the sciatic nerve protruding there, surely, isn't it? Ow! But no, it didn't hurt after all. My new clothes, too. I put them on today for the first time. What bad luck. Now you're holding my leg upside down. Of course all my money comes out of my trouser pocket. And there's my ticket for the séance. I must have that. I may use it after all." He tweaked it out of the fingers of the man who had picked it up, and laughed to see the expression of amazement on his face as the card suddenly vanished. That gave him something fresh to think about, and he pondered for a moment over some touch of association set up by it. "I have it," he thought. "It is clear that the moment I came into connection with that card it became invisible. I'm invisible myself, of course to the grosser sense, and everything I hold becomes invisible. Most interesting. That accounts for the sudden appearances of small objects at a séance. The spirit has been holding them, and as long as he holds them, they are invisible. Then he lets go, and there's the flower or the spirit photograph on the table. It accounts, too, for the sudden disappearances of such objects. The spirit has taken them, though the scoffers say that the medium has secreted them about his person. It is true that when searched he sometimes appears to have done so, but after all that may be a joke on the part of the spirit. Now, what am I to do with myself? Let me see, there's the clock. It's just 10:30. All this has happened in a few minutes, for it's 15:15 when I left my house. 10:30 now. What does that mean exactly? I used to know what it meant, but now it seems nonsense. 10 what? Hours, is it? What's an hour? This was very puzzling. He felt that he used to know what an hour and a minute meant, but the perception of that, naturally enough, had ceased with his emergence from time and space into eternity. The conception of time was like some memory which, refusing to record itself on the consciousness, lies perdu in some dark corner of the brain, laughing at the efforts of the owner to ferret it out. While he still interrogated his mind over this lapsed perception, he found that space as well as time had similarly grown obsolete for him, for he caught sight of his friend, Miss Ida Soulsby, who he knew was to be present at the séance for which he was bound, hurrying with bird-like steps down the pavement opposite. Forgetting for the moment that he was a disembodied spirit, he made the effort of will which in his past human existence would have set his legs in pursuit of her, and found that the effort of will alone was enough to place him at her side. "My dear Miss Soulsby," he said, "I was on my way to Mrs. Cumberbatch's house when I was knocked down and killed. It was far from unpleasant, a moment's headache." So far his natural volubility had carried him before he recollected that he was invisible and inaudible to those still closed in by the muddy vesture of decay, and stopped short. But though it was clear that what he said was inaudible to Miss Soulsby's rather large, intelligent-looking ears, it seemed that some consciousness of his presence was conveyed to her finer sense, for she looked suddenly startled. A flush rose to her face, and he heard her murmur, "Very odd. I wonder why I received so vivid an impression of dear Teddy." That gave Mr. Tilly a pleasant shock. He had long admired the lady, and here she was alluding to him in her supposed privacy as dear Teddy. That was followed by a momentary regret that he had been killed. He would have liked to have been possessed of this information before, and had pursued the primrose path of dalliance down which it seemed to lead. His intentions, of course, would, as always, have been strictly honourable. The path of dalliance would have conducted them both, if she consented, to the altar, where the primroses would have been exchanged for orange blossom. But his regret was quite short-lived. Though the altar seemed inaccessible, the primrose path might still be open, for many of the spiritualistic circle in which he lived were on the most affectionate terms with the spiritual guides and friends who, like himself, had passed over. From a human point of view, these innocent and even elevating flirtations had always seemed to him rather bloodless, But now, looking on them from the far side, he saw how charming they were, for they gave him the sense of still having a place and an identity in the world he had just quitted. He pressed Miss Ida's hand, or rather put himself into the spiritual condition of doing so, and could vaguely feel that it had some hint of warmth and solidity about it. From a human point of view, these innocent and even elevating flirtations had always seemed to him rather bloodless. But now, looking on them from the far side, he saw how charming they were, for they gave him the sense of still having a place and an identity in the world he had just quitted. He pressed Miss Ida's hand, or rather put himself into the spiritual condition of doing so, and could vaguely feel that it had some hint of warmth and solidity about it. This was gratifying, for it showed that though he had passed out of the material plane, he could still be in touch with it. Still more gratifying was it to observe that a pleased and secret smile overspread Miss Ida's fine features as he gave this token of his presence. Perhaps she smiled at her own thoughts, but in any case it was he who had inspired them. Encouraged by this, he indulged in a slightly more intimate token of affection, and permitted himself a respectful salute, and saw that he had gone too far, for she said to herself, "Hush, hush," and quickened her pace, as if to leave these amorous thoughts behind. He felt that he was beginning to adjust himself to the new conditions in which he would now live, or, at any rate, was getting some sort of inkling as to what they were. Time existed no more for him, nor yet did space, since the wish to be at Miss Ida's side had instantly transported him there, and, with a view to testing this further, he wished himself back in his flat. As swiftly as the change of a scene in a cinematograph show, he found himself there, and perceived that the news of his death must have reached his servants, for the cook and parlour-maid, with excited faces, were talking over the event. "Poor little gentleman," said the cook. "It seems such a shame, it does. He never hurt a fly, and to think of one of those great engines laying him out flat. I hope they'll take him to the cemetery from the hospital. I never could bear a corpse in the house." The great strapping parlour-maid tossed her head. "Well, I'm not sure that it doesn't serve him right," she observed. "Always messing about with spirits he was, and the knockings and concertinas was awful sometimes when I'd been laying out supper in the dining-room. Now perhaps he'll come himself and visit the rest of the loonies. But I'm sorry all the same. A less troublesome little gentleman never stepped. Always pleasant too, and wages paid to the day." These regretful comments and encomiums were something of a shock to Mr. Tilly. He had imagined that his excellent servants regarded him with a respectful affection, as befitted some sort of demigod, and the role of the poor little gentleman was not at all to his mind. This revelation of their true estimate of him, although what they thought of him could no longer have the smallest significance, irritated him profoundly. "I never heard such impertinence," he said, so he thought, quite out loud, and still intensely earthbound, was astonished to see that they had no perception whatever of his presence. He raised his voice, replete with extreme irony, and addressed his cook. "You may reserve your criticism on my character for your saucepans," he said. "They will no doubt appreciate them. As regards the arrangements for my funeral, I have already provided for them in my will, and do not propose to consult your convenience." "Law!" said Mrs. Inglis. "I declare I can almost hear his voice, poor little fellow. Husky it was, as if he would do better by clearing his throat. I suppose I'd better be making a black bow for my cap. His lawyers and what not will be here presently." Mr. Tilly had no sympathy with this suggestion. He was immensely conscious of being quite alive, and the idea of his servants behaving as if he were dead, especially after the way in which they had spoken about him, was very vexing. He wanted to give them some striking evidence of his presence and his activity, and he banged his hand angrily on the dining-room table, from which the breakfast equipage had not yet been cleared. 3 tremendous blows he gave it, and was rejoiced to see that his parlour-maid looked startled. Mrs. Inglis's face remained perfectly placid. "Why, if I didn't hear a sort of rapping sound," said Miss Tarleton. "Where did it come from?" "Nonsense! You've got the jumps, dear," said Mrs. Inglis, picking up a remaining rasher of bacon on a fork and putting it into her capacious mouth. Mr. Tilly was delighted at making any impression at all on either of these impercipient females. "Tarleton!" he called at the top of his voice. "Why, what's that?" said Tarleton. "Almost hear his voice. Did you say, Mrs. Inglis? I declare I did hear his voice then. A pack of nonsense, dear, said Mrs. Inglis placidly. That's a prime bit of bacon, and there's a good cut of it left. Why, you all of a tremble. It's your imagination. Suddenly it struck Mr. Tilly that he might be employing himself much better than, with such extreme exertion, managing to convey so slight a hint of his presence to his parlour-maid, and that the séance at the house of the medium, Mrs. Cumberbatch, would afford him much easier opportunities of getting through to the earth-plane again. He gave a couple more thumps to the table, and, wishing himself at Mrs. Cumberbatch's, nearly a mile away, scarcely heard the faint scream of Tarleton at the sound of his blows, before he found himself in West Norfolk Street. He knew the house well, and went straight to the drawing-room, which was the scene of the séances he had so often and so eagerly attended. Mrs. Cumberbatch, who had a long spoon-shaped face, had already pulled down the blinds, leaving the room in total darkness, except for the glimmer of a tiny night-light which, under a shade of ruby glass, stood on the chimney-piece in front of the coloured photograph of Cardinal Newman. Round the table were seated Miss Ida Soulsby, Mr. and Mrs. Marriott, who paid their guineas at least twice a week in order to consult with their spiritual guide Abibel and receive mysterious advice about their indigestion and investments, and Sir John Place, who was much interested in learning the details of his previous incarnation as a Chaldean priest, completed the circle. His guide, who revealed to him his sacerdotal career, was playfully called Messpot. Naturally, many other spirits visited them, for Miss Soulsby had no less than 3 guides in her spiritual household: Sapphire, Semiramis, and Sweet William, while Napoleon and Plato were not infrequent guests. Cardinal Newman, too, was a great favourite, and they encouraged his presence by the singing in unison of Lead, Kindly Light. He could hardly ever resist that. Mr. Tilly observed with pleasure that there was a vacant seat by the table, which no doubt had been placed there for him. As he entered, Mrs. Cumberbatch peered at her watch. 11 o'clock already, she said, and Mr. Tilly is not here yet. I wonder what can have kept him. What shall we do, dear friends? Abibel gets very impatient sometimes if we keep him waiting. Mr. and Mrs. Marriott were getting impatient too, for he terribly wanted to ask about Mexican oils, and she had a very vexing heartburn. And Messpot doesn't like waiting either, said Sir John, jealous for the prestige of his protector. Not to mention Sweet William. Miss Soulsby gave a little silvery laugh. Oh, but my Sweet William's so good and kind, she said. Besides, I have a feeling, quite a psychic feeling, Mrs. Cumberbatch, that Mr. Tilly is very close. So I am, said Mr. Tilly. Indeed, as I walked here, continued Miss Soulsby, I felt that Mr. Tilly was somewhere quite close to me. Dear me, what's that? Mr. Tilly was so delighted at being sensed that he could not resist giving a tremendous tap on the table in a sort of pleased applause. Mrs. Cumberbatch heard it too. I'm sure that's Abibel come to tell us he is ready, she said. I know Abibel's knock. A little patience, Abibel. Let's give Mr. Tilly 3 minutes more and then begin. Perhaps if we put up the blinds, Abibel will understand we haven't begun. This was done, and Miss Soulsby glided to the window in order to make known Mr. Tilly's approach, for he always came along the opposite pavement and crossed over by the little island in the river of traffic. There was evidently some lately published news, for the readers of early editions were busy, and she caught sight of one of the advertisement boards bearing in large letters the announcement of a terrible accident at Hyde Park Corner. She drew in her breath with a hissing sound and turned away, unwilling to have her psychic tranquillity upset by the intrusion of painful incidents. But Mr. Tilly, who had followed her to the window and saw what she had seen, could hardly restrain a spiritual whoop of exultation. "Why, it's about me," he said. "Such large letters, too. Very gratifying. Subsequent editions will no doubt contain my name." He gave another loud rap to call attention to himself, and Mrs. Cumberbatch, sitting down in her antique chair, which had once belonged to Madame Blavatsky, again heard. "Well, if that isn't Abibel again," she said. "Be quiet, naughty. Perhaps we had better begin." She recited the usual invocation to guides and angels, and leaned back in her chair. Presently she began to twitch and mutter, and shortly afterwards, with several loud snorts, relapsed into cataleptic immobility. There she lay, stiff as a poker, a port of call, so to speak, for any voyaging intelligence. With pleased anticipation Mr. Tilly awaited their coming. How gratifying if Napoleon, with whom he had so often talked, recognised him and said, "Pleased to see you, Mr. Tilly. I perceive you have joined us." The room was dark except for the ruby-shaded lamp in front of Cardinal Newman, but to Mr. Tilly's emancipated perceptions the withdrawal of mere material light made no difference, and he idly wondered why it was generally supposed that disembodied spirits like himself produced their most powerful effects in the dark. He could not imagine the reason for that, and what puzzled him still more, there was not to his spiritual perception any sign of those colleagues of his, for so he might now call them, who usually attended Mrs. Cumberbatch's séance in such gratifying numbers. Though she had been moaning and muttering a long time now, Mr. Tilly was in no way conscious of the presence of Abibel and Sweet William and Sapphire and Napoleon. They ought to be here by now, he said to himself. But while he still wondered at their absence, he saw to his amazed disgust the medium's hand, now covered with a black glove, and thus invisible to ordinary human vision in the darkness, was groping about under the table and clearly searching for the megaphone trumpet which lay there. He found that he could read her mind with the same ease, though far less satisfaction, as he had read Miss Ida's half an hour ago, and knew that she was intending to apply the trumpet to her own mouth and pretend to be Abibel or Semirantis or somebody, whereas she affirmed that she never touched the trumpet herself. Much shocked at this, he snatched up the trumpet himself and observed that she was not in trance at all, for she opened her sharp black eyes, which always reminded him of buttons covered with American cloth, and gave a great gasp. "Why, Mr. Tilly," she said, "on the spiritual plane too." The rest of the circle was now singing Lead, Kindly Light in order to encourage Cardinal Newman, and this conversation was conducted under cover of the hoarse, crooning voices. But Mr. Tilly had the feeling that though Mrs. Cumberbatch saw and heard him as clearly as he saw her, he was quite imperceptible to the others. "Yes, I've been killed," he said, "and I want to get in touch with the material world. That's why I came here. But I want to get in touch with other spirits too, and surely Abibel or Messpot ought to be here by this time." He received no answer, and her eyes fell before his like those of a detected charlatan. A terrible suspicion invaded his mind. "What, are you a fraud, Mrs. Cumberbatch?" he asked. "Oh, for shame! Think of all the guineas I paid you." "You shall have them back," said Mrs. Cumberbatch. "But don't tell of me." She began to whimper, and he remembered that she often made that sort of sniffling noise when Abibel was taking possession of her. "That usually means that Abibel is coming," he said with withering sarcasm. "Come along, Abibel, we're waiting." "Give me the trumpet," whispered the miserable medium. "Oh, please give me the trumpet." "I shall do nothing of the kind," said Mr. Tilly indignantly. "I would sooner use it myself." "Ah!" She gave a sob of relief. "Oh, do, Mr. Tilly," she said. "What a wonderful idea. It will be most interesting to everybody to hear you talk just after you've been killed. And before they know, it would be the making of me. And I'm not a fraud, at least not altogether. I do have spiritual perceptions sometimes. Spirits do communicate through me. And when they won't come through, it's a dreadful temptation to a poor woman to supplement them by human agency. And how could I be seeing and hearing you now and be able to talk to you, so pleasantly I'm sure, if I hadn't supernormal powers? You've been killed, so you assure me, and yet I can see and hear you, quite plainly. Where did it happen, may I ask, if it's not a painful subject?" "Hyde Park Corner half an hour ago," said Mr. Tilly. "No, it only hurt for a moment, thanks." "But what about your other suggestion?" While the third verse of Lead, Kindly Light was going on, Mr. Tilly applied his mind to this difficult situation. It was quite true that if Mrs. Cumberbatch had no power of communication with the unseen, she could not possibly have seen him. But she evidently had, and had heard him too, for the conversation had certainly been conducted on the spirit plane with perfect lucidity. Naturally, now that he was a genuine spirit, he did not want to be mixed up in a fraudulent mediumship, for he felt that such a thing would seriously compromise him on the other side, where, probably, it was widely known that Mrs. Cumberbatch was a person to be avoided. But on the other hand, having so soon found a medium through whom he could communicate with his friends, it was hard to take a high moral view and say that he would have nothing whatever to do with her. "I don't know if I trust you," he said. "I shouldn't have a moment's peace if I thought that you were sending all sorts of bogus messages from me to the Circle, which I wasn't responsible for at all. You've done it with Abibel and Messpot. How can I know that when I don't choose to communicate through you, you won't make up all sorts of piffle on your own account?" She positively squirmed in her chair. "Oh, I'll turn over a new leaf," she said. I will leave all that sort of thing behind me. And I am a medium. Look at me. Aren't I more real to you than any of the others? Don't I belong in your plane in a way that none of the others do? I may be occasionally fraudulent, and I can no more get Napoleon here than I can fly, but I'm genuine as well. Oh, Mr. Tilly, be indulgent to us poor human creatures. It isn't so long since you were one of us yourself. The mention of Napoleon, with the information that Mrs. Cumberbatch had never been controlled by that great creature, wounded Mr. Tilly again. Often in this darkened room he had held long colloquies with him, and Napoleon had given him most interesting details of his life on St. Helena, which, so Mr. Tilly had found, were often borne out by Lord Rosebery's pleasant volume, The Last Phase. But now the whole thing wore a more sinister aspect, and suspicion as solid as certainty bumped against his mind. "Confess," he said, "where did you get all that Napoleon talk from? You told us you had never read Lord Rosebery's book, and allowed us to look through your library to see that it wasn't there. Be honest for once, Mrs. Cumberbatch." She suppressed a sob. "I will," she said. "The book was there all the time. I put it in an old cover called Elegant Extracts. But I'm not wholly a fraud. We are talking together. You a spirit, and I a mortal female. They can't hear us talk, but only look at me and you'll see. You can talk to them through me if you'll only be so kind. I don't often get in touch with a genuine spirit like yourself." Mr. Tilly glanced at the other sitters and then back to the medium, who, to keep the others interested, was making weird gurgling sounds like an undervitalized siphon. Certainly she was far clearer to him than were the others, and her argument that she was able to see and hear him had great weight. And then a new and curious perception came to him. Her mind seemed to spread out before him like a pool of slightly muddy water, and he figured himself as standing on a header-board above it, perfectly able, if he chose, to immerse himself in it. The objection to so doing was its muddiness, its materiality. The reason for so doing was that then he felt he would be able to be heard by the others, possibly to be seen by them. As it was, the loudest bangs on the table were only faintly perceptible. "I'm beginning to understand," he said. "Oh, Mr. Tilly, just jump in like a kind good spirit," she said. "Make your own test conditions. Put your hand over my mouth to make sure that I'm not speaking, and keep hold of the trumpet." "And you'll promise not to cheat me any more?" he asked. "Never." He made up his mind. "All right, then," he said, and, so to speak, dived into her mind. He experienced the oddest sensation. It was like passing out of some fine, sunny air into the stuffiest of unventilated rooms. Space and time closed over him again. His head swam. His eyes were heavy. Then, with the trumpet in one hand, he laid the other firmly over her mouth. Looking round, he saw that the room seemed almost completely dark, but that the outline of the figures sitting round the table had vastly gained in solidity. "Here I am," he said briskly. Miss Soulsby gave a startled exclamation. "That's Mr. Tilly's voice," she whispered. "Why, of course it is," said Mr. Tilly. "I've just passed over at Hyde Park Corner, under a traction engine." He felt the dead weight of the medium's mind, her conventional conceptions, her mild, unreal piety pressing in on him from all sides, stifling and confusing him. Whatever he said had to pass through muddy water. "There's a wonderful feeling of joy and lightness," he said. "I can't tell you of the sunshine and happiness. We're all very busy and active, helping others, and it's such a pleasure, dear friends, to be able to get in touch with you all again. Death is not death, it is the gate of life." He broke off suddenly. "Oh, I can't stand this," he said to the medium. "You make me talk such twaddle. Do get your stupid mind out of the way. Can't we do anything in which you won't interfere with me so much?" "Can you give us some spirit lights round the room?" suggested Mrs. Cumberbatch in a sleepy voice. "You have come through beautifully, Mr. Tilly. It is too dear of you." "You sure you haven't arranged some phosphorescent patches already?" asked Mr. Tilly suspiciously. "Yes, there are one or two near the chimney-piece," said Mrs. Cumberbatch, "but none anywhere else. Dear Mr. Tilly, I swear they're not. Just give us a nice star with long rays on the ceiling." Mr. Tilly was the most good-natured of men, always willing to help an unattractive female in distress, and whispering to her, "I shall require the phosphorescent patches to be given into my hands after the séance," he proceeded by the mere effort of his imagination to light a beautiful big star with red and violet rays on the ceiling. Of course it was not nearly as brilliant as his own conception of it, for its light had to pass through the opacity of the medium's mind, but it was still a most striking object and elicited gasps of applause from the company. To enhance the effect of it, he intoned a few very pretty lines about a star by Adelaide Ann Proctor, whose poems had always seemed to him to emanate from the topmost peak of Parnassus. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Tilly," whispered the medium. "It was lovely. Would a photograph of it be permitted on some future occasion if you would be so kind to reproduce it again?" "Oh, I don't know," said Mr. Tilly irritably. "I want to get out. I'm very hot and uncomfortable. And it's all so cheap." "Cheap!" ejaculated Mrs. Cumberbatch. "Why, there's not a medium in London whose future wouldn't be made by a real, genuine star like that. Say, twice a week." "But I wasn't run over in order that I might make the fortunes of mediums," said Mr. Tilly. "I want to go. It's all rather degrading. And I want to see something of my new world. I don't know what it's like yet." "Oh, but Mr. Tilly," she said, "you told us lovely things about it, how busy and happy you were." "No, I didn't. It was you who said that. At least it was you who put it into my head." Even as he wished, he found himself emerging from the dull waters of Mrs. Cumberbatch's mind. "There's a whole new world waiting for me," he said. "I must go and see it. I'll come back and tell you, for it must be full of marvellous revelations." Suddenly, he felt the hopelessness of it. There was that thick fluid of materiality to pierce, and as it dripped off him again, he began to see that nothing of that fine, rare quality of life, which he had just begun to experience, could penetrate these opacities. That was why, perhaps, all that thus came across from the spirit world was so stupid, so banal. They of whom he now was one could tap on furniture, could light stars, could abound with commonplace, could read as in a book the mind of medium or sitters, but nothing more. They had to pass into the region of gross perceptions in order to be seen of blind eyes and be heard of deaf ears. Mrs. Cumberbatch stared. "The power is failing," she said in a deep voice which Mr. Tilly felt was meant to imitate his own. "I must leave you now, dear friends." He felt much exasperated. "The power isn't failing," he shouted. "It wasn't I who said that. Besides, I've got to see if it's true. Goodbye. Don't cheat any more." He dropped his card of admittance to the séance on the table and heard murmurs of excitement as he floated off. The news of the wonderful star in the presence of Mr. Tilly at the séance within half an hour of his death, which at the time was unknown to any of the sitters, spread swiftly through spiritualistic circles. The Psychical Research Society sent investigators to take independent evidence from all those present, but were inclined to attribute the occurrences to a subtle mixture of thought transference and unconscious visual impression when they heard that Miss Soulsby had, a few minutes previously, seen a newsboard in the street outside recording the accident at Hyde Park Corner. This explanation was rather elaborate, for it postulated that Miss Soulsby, thinking of Mr. Tilly's non-arrival, had combined that with the accident at Hyde Park Corner, and had probably, though unconsciously, seen the name of the victim on another newsboard, and had transferred the whole thing by telepathy to the mind of the medium. As for the star in the ceiling, though they could not account for it, they certainly found remains of phosphorescent paint on the panels of the wall above the chimney-piece, and came to the conclusion that the star had been produced by some similar contrivance. So they rejected the whole thing, which was a pity, since for once the phenomena were absolutely genuine. Miss Soulsby continued to be a constant attendant at Mrs. Cumberbatch's séances, but never experienced the presence of Mr. Tilly again. On that the reader may put any interpretation he pleases. It looks to me somewhat as if he had found something else to do, but he had emerged too far and perceived that nobody except the medium heard him. "Oh, don't be vexed, Mr. Tilly," she said. "That's only a formula, but you're leaving us very soon. Not time for just one materialization? They are more convincing than anything to most inquirers." "Not one," said he. "You don't understand how stifling it is even to speak through you, and make stars. But I'll come back as soon as I find there's anything new that I can get through to you. What's the use of my repeating all that stale stuff about being busy and happy? They've been told that often enough already." End of Mr. Tilly's Seance. Recording by David Lewis Richardson, Lancashire, England.
Okay. How's it going now? Is it like still really bad? Hmm. What do you think, Brian? Cause it's showing it's good. Usually, oops, wrong one. It's usually blah 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 blah. Holy mouth, Nadine, get it working. Um, you see there, it says it's showing as it's good. So I wonder. Hmm. Like this all shows it's still good too. So I don't know what to do about that. Shouldn't be. Yeah, it should be. That's what it's supposed to be. Hmm. 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 I do not know. I do not know. I'm gonna pop back in the other screen. Okay, well, Brian's not listening, or he's busy. So I'm gonna play again. Let me know if you see it's not showing up very good, or because it looks like it's streaming okay according to the dashboard. And believe me, when it gets angry, it lets you know. So I'm not sure what to do about that. Hmm. Anyway, it's Beyond the Wall of Sleep by H.P. Lovecraft now. So, um, back here.
Beyond the Wall of Sleep by H.P. Lovecraft. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Beyond the Wall of Sleep by H.P. Lovecraft. I have often wondered if the majority of mankind ever pause to reflect upon the occasionally titanic significance of dreams, and of the obscure world to which they belong. Whilst the greater number of our nocturnal visions are perhaps no more than faint and fantastic reflections of our waking experiences, Freud, to the contrary, with his puerile symbolism, there are still a certain remainder whose immundane and ethereal character permit of no ordinary interpretation, and whose vaguely exciting and disquieting effect suggests possible minute glimpses into a sphere of mental existence no less important than physical life, yet separated from that life by an all but impassable barrier. From my experience, I cannot doubt but that man, when lost to terrestrial consciousness, is indeed sojourning in another and uncorporeal life of far different nature from the life we know, and of which only the slightest and most indistinct memories linger after waking. From those blurred and fragmentary memories we may infer much, yet prove little. We may guess that in dreams, life, matter, and vitality, as the earth knows such things, are not necessarily constant, and that time and space do not exist as our waking selves comprehend them. Sometimes I believe that this less material life is our truer life, and that our vain presence on the terraqueous globe is itself the secondary or merely virtual phenomenon. It was from a youthful reverie, filled with speculations of this sort, that I arose one afternoon in the winter of 1900-01, when to the State Psychopathic Institution in which I served as an intern was brought the man whose case has ever since haunted me so unceasingly. His name, as given on the records, was Joe Slater, or Slarder, and his appearance was that of the typical denizen of the Catskill Mountain region, one of those strange, repellent scions of a primitive colonial peasant stock whose isolation for nearly 3 centuries in the hilly fastnesses of a little-travelled countryside has caused them to sink to a kind of barbaric degeneracy rather than advance with their more fortunately placed brethren of the thickly settled districts. Among these odd folk, who correspond exactly to the decadent element of white trash in the South, law and morals are non-existent, and their general mental status is probably below that of any other section of Native American people. Joe Slater, who came to the institution in the vigilant custody of 4 state policemen, and who was described as a highly dangerous character, certainly presented no evidence of his perilous disposition when I first beheld him. Though well above middle stature, and of somewhat brawny frame, he was given an absurd appearance of harmless stupidity by the pale, sleepy blueness of his small, watery eyes, the scantiness of his neglected and never-shaven growth of yellow beard, and the listless drooping of his heavy nether lip. His age was unknown, since among his kind neither family records nor permanent family ties exist, but from the baldness of his head in front, and from the decayed condition of his teeth, the head surgeon wrote him down as a man of about 40. From the medical and court documents we learned all that could be gathered of his case. This man, a vagabond, hunter, and trapper, had always been strange in the eyes of his primitive associates. He had habitually slept at night beyond the ordinary time, and upon waking would often talk of unknown things in a manner so bizarre as to inspire fear even in the hearts of an unimaginative populace. Not that his form of language was at all unusual, for he never spoke save in the debased patois of his environment, but the tone and tenor of his utterance were of such mysterious wildness that none might listen without apprehension. He himself was generally as terrified and baffled as his auditors, and within an hour after awakening would forget all that he had said, or at least all that had caused him to say what he did, relapsing into a bovine, half-amiable normality, like that of the other hill-dwellers. As Slater grew older, it appeared his matutinal aberrations had gradually increased in frequency and violence, till about a month before his arrival at the institution had occurred the shocking tragedy which caused his arrest by the authorities. One day, near noon, after a profound sleep begun in a whiskey debauch at about 5 of the previous afternoon, the man had aroused himself most suddenly, with ululations so horrible and unearthly that they brought several neighbours to his cabin, a filthy sty where he dwelt with a family as indescribable as himself. Rushing out into the snow, he had flung his arms aloft and commenced a series of leaps directly upward in the air, the while shouting his determination to reach some big cabin with brightness in the roof and walls and floor and the loud queer music far away. As 2 men of moderate size sought to restrain him, He had struggled with maniacal force and fury, screaming of his desire and need to find and kill a certain thing that shines and shakes and laughs. At length, after temporarily felling one of his detainers with a sudden blow, he had flung himself upon the other in a demoniac ecstasy of bloodthirstiness, shrieking fiendishly that he would jump high in the air and burn his way through anything that stopped him. Family and neighbors had now fled in a panic, and when the most courageous of them returned, Slater was gone, leaving behind an unrecognizable, pulp-like thing that had been a living man but an hour before. None of the mountaineers had dared to pursue him, and it is likely that they would have welcomed his death from the cold, but when several mornings later they heard his screams from a distant ravine, they realized that he had somehow managed to survive, and that his removal in one way or another would be necessary. They had followed an armed searching party, whose purpose, whatever it may have been originally, became that of a sheriff's posse after one of the seldom popular state troopers had by accident observed, then questioned, and finally joined the seekers. On the third day, Slater was found unconscious in the hollow of a tree, and taken to the nearest jail, where alienists from Albany examined him as soon as his senses returned. To them he told a simple story. He had, he said, gone to sleep one afternoon about sundown, after drinking much liquor. He had awakened to find himself standing, bloody-handed, in the snow, before his cabin, the mangled corpse of his neighbour, Peter Slade, at his feet. Horrified, he had taken to the woods in a vague effort to escape from the scene of what must have been his crime. Beyond these things he seemed to know nothing, nor could the expert questioning of his interrogators bring out a single additional fact. That night Slater slept quietly, and the next morning he awakened with no singular feature save a certain alteration of expression. Dr. Barnard, who had been watching the patient, thought he noticed in the pale blue eyes a certain gleam of peculiar quality, and in the flaccid lips an all but imperceptible tightening, as if of intelligent determination. But, when questioned, Slater relapsed into the habitual vacancy of the mountaineer, and only reiterated what he had said on the preceding day. On the third morning occurred the first of the man's mental attacks. After some show of uneasiness in sleep, he burst forth into a frenzy so powerful that the combined efforts of 4 men were needed to bind him in a straitjacket. The alienists listened with keen attention to his words, since their curiosity had been aroused to a high pitch by the suggestive yet mostly conflicting and incoherent stories of his family and neighbours. Slater raved for upward of 15 minutes, babbling in his backwoods dialect of green edifices of light, oceans of space, strange music, and shadowy mountains and valleys. But most of all did he dwell upon some mysterious blazing entity that shook and laughed and mocked at him. This vast, vague personality seemed to have done him a terrible wrong, and to kill it in a triumphant revenge was his paramount desire. In order to reach it, he said, he would soar through abysses of emptiness, burning every obstacle that stood in his way. Thus ran his discourse, until with the greatest suddenness he ceased. The fire of madness died from his eyes, and in dull wonder he looked at his questioners, and asked why he was bound. Dr. Barnard unbuckled the leather harness, and did not restore it till night, when he succeeded in persuading Slater to don it of his own volition, for his own good. The man had now admitted that he sometimes talked queerly, though he knew not why. Within a week 2 more attacks appeared, but from them the doctors learned little. On the source of Slater's visions they speculated at length, for, since he could neither read nor write, and had apparently never heard a legend or fairy tale, his gorgeous imagery was quite inexplicable. That it could not come from any known myth or romance was made especially clear by the fact that the unfortunate lunatic expressed himself only in his own simple manner. He raved of things he did not understand and could not interpret, things which he claimed to have experienced, but which he could not have learned through any normal or connected narration. The alienists soon agreed that abnormal dreams were the foundation of the trouble, dreams whose vividness could for a time completely dominate the waking mind of this basically inferior man. With due formality, Slater was tried for murder, acquitted on the ground of insanity, and committed to the institution wherein I held so humble a post. I have said that I am a constant speculator concerning dream life, and from this you may judge of the eagerness with which I applied myself to the study of the new patient as soon as I had fully ascertained the facts of his case. He seemed to sense a certain friendliness in me, born, no doubt, of the interest I could not conceal, and the gentle manner in which I questioned him. Not that he ever recognized me during his attacks, when I hung breathlessly to his chaotic but cosmic word pictures, but he knew me in his quiet hours, when he would sit by his barred window, weaving baskets of straw and willow, and perhaps pining for the mountain freedom he could never again enjoy. His family never called to see him. Probably it had found another temporary head, after the manner of decadent mountain folk. By degrees I commenced to feel an overwhelming wonder at the mad and fantastic conceptions of Joe Slater. The man himself was pitiably inferior in mentality and language alike, but his glowing, titanic visions, though described in a barbarous, disjointed jargon, were assuredly things which only a superior, or even exceptional brain could conceive. How, I often asked myself, could the stolid imagination of a Catskill degenerate conjure up sights whose very possession argued a lurking spark of genius? How could any backwoods dullard have gained so much as an idea of those glittering realms of supernatural radiance and space about which Slater ranted in his furious delirium? More and more I inclined to the belief that in the pitiful personality who cringed before me lay the disordered nucleus of something beyond my comprehension, something infinitely beyond the comprehension of my more experienced, but less imaginative, medical and scientific colleagues. And yet I could extract nothing definite from the man. The sum of all my investigation was that in a kind of semi-corporeal dream life Slater wandered or floated through resplendent and prodigious valleys, meadows, gardens, cities, and palaces of light, in a region unbounded and unknown to man. That there he was no peasant or degenerate, but a creature of importance and vivid life, moving proudly and dominantly, and checked only by a certain deadly enemy, who seemed to be a being of visible yet ethereal structure, and who did not appear to be of human shape, since Slater never referred to it as a man, or as aught save a thing. This thing had done Slater some hideous but unnamed wrong, which the maniac, if maniac he were, yearned to avenge. From the manner in which Slater alluded to their dealings, I judged that he and the luminous thing had met on equal terms, that in his dream existence the man was himself a luminous thing of the same race as his enemy. This impression was sustained by his frequent references to flying through space and burning all that impeded his progress. Yet these conceptions were formulated in rustic words wholly inadequate to convey them, a circumstance which drove me to the conclusion that if a dream world indeed existed, oral language was not its medium for the transmission of thought. Could it be that the dream soul, inhabiting this inferior body, was desperately struggling to speak things which the simple and halting tongue of dullness could not utter? Could it be that I was face to face with intellectual emanations which would explain the mystery if I could but learn to discover and read them? I did not tell the older physicians of these things, for middle age is sceptical, cynical, and disinclined to accept new ideas. Besides, the head of the institution had but lately warned me, in his paternal way, that I was overworking, that my mind needed rest. It had long been my belief that human thought consists basically of atomic or molecular motion, convertible into either waves or radiant energy like heat, light, and electricity. This belief had early led me to contemplate the possibility of telepathy, or mental communication by means of suitable apparatus, and I had, in my college days, prepared a set of transmitting and receiving instruments somewhat similar to the cumbrous devices employed in wireless telegraphy at that crude pre-radio period. These I had tested with a fellow student, but achieving no result, had soon packed them away with other scientific odds and ends for possible future use. Now, in my intense desire to probe into the dream life of Slater, I sought these instruments again, and spent several days in repairing them for action. When they were complete, once more, I missed no opportunity for their trial. At each outburst of Slater's violence, I would fit the transmitter to his forehead and the receiver to my own, constantly making delicate adjustments for various hypothetical wavelengths of intellectual energy. I had but little notion of how the thought impressions would, if successfully conveyed, arouse an intelligent response in my brain, but I felt certain that I could detect and interpret them. Accordingly, I continued my experiments, though informing no one of their nature. It was on the 21st of February, 1901, that the thing occurred. As I look back across the years, I realize how unreal it seems, and sometimes wonder if old Dr. Fenton was not right when he charged it all to my excited imagination. I recall that he listened with great kindness and patience when I told him, but afterward gave me a nerve powder, and arranged for the half-year's vacation, on which I departed the next week. That fateful night I was wildly agitated and perturbed, for despite the excellent care he had received, Joe Slater was unmistakably dying. Perhaps it was his mountain freedom that he missed, or perhaps the turmoil in his brain had grown too acute for his rather sluggish physique. But, at all events, the flame of his vitality flickered low in the decadent body. He was drowsy near the end, and as darkness fell, he dropped off into a troubled sleep. I did not strap on the strait-jacket, as was customary when he slept, since I saw that he was too feeble to be dangerous, even if he woke in mental disorder once more before passing away. But I did place upon his head and mine the two ends of my cosmic radio, hoping against hope for a first and last message from the dream world in the brief time remaining. In the cell with us was one nurse, a mediocre fellow who did not understand the purpose of the apparatus or think to inquire into my course. As the hours wore on, I saw his head droop awkwardly in sleep, but I did not disturb him. I myself, lulled by the rhythmical breathing of the healthy and the dying man, must have nodded a little later. The sound of weird lyric melody was what aroused me. Chords, vibrations, and harmonic ecstasies echoed passionately on every hand, while on my ravished sight burst the stupendous spectacle of ultimate beauty. Walls, columns, and architraves of living fire blazed effulgently around the spot where I seemed to float in air, extending upward to an infinitely high vaulted dome of indescribable splendor. Blending with this display of palatial magnificence, or rather supplanting it at times in kaleidoscopic rotation, were glimpses of wide plains and graceful valleys, high mountains and inviting grottos, covered with every lovely attribute of scenery which my delighted eyes could conceive of, yet formed wholly of some glowing, ethereal, plastic entity, which in consistency partook as much of spirit as of matter. As I gazed, I perceived that my own brain held the key to these enchanting metamorphoses, for each vista which appeared to me was the one my changing mind most wished to behold. Amidst this Elysian realm I dwelt not as a stranger, for each sight and sound was familiar to me, just as it had been for uncounted eons of eternity before, and would be for like eternities to come. Then the resplendent aura of my brother of light drew near, and held colloquy with me, soul to soul, with silent and perfect interchange of thought. The hour was one of approaching triumph, for was not my fellow being escaping at last from a degrading periodic bondage, escaping for ever, and preparing to follow the accursed oppressor even unto the uttermost fields of ether, that upon it might be wrought a flaming cosmic vengeance which would shake the spheres? We floated thus for a little time, when I perceived a slight blurring and fading of the objects around us, as though some force were recalling me to earth, where I least wished to go. The form near me seemed to feel a change also, for it gradually brought its discourse toward a conclusion, and itself prepared to quit the scene, fading from my sight at a rate somewhat less rapid than that of the other objects. A few more thoughts were exchanged, and I knew that the luminous one and I were being recalled to bondage, though for my brother of light it would be the last time. The sorry planet shell being well nigh spent, in less than an hour my fellow would be free to pursue the oppressor along the Milky Way, and pass the hither stars to the very confines of infinity. A well-defined shock separates my final impression of the fading scene of light from my sudden and somewhat shamefaced awakening and straightening up in my chair as I saw the dying figure on the couch move hesitantly. Joe Slater was indeed awakening, though probably for the last time. As I looked more closely, I saw that in the sallow cheeks shone spots of colour which had never before been present. The lips, too, seemed unusual, being tightly compressed, as if by the force of a stronger character than had been Slater's. The whole face finally began to grow tense, and the head turned restlessly with closed eyes. I did not rouse the sleeping nurse, but readjusted the slightly disarranged headband of my telepathic radio, intent to catch any parting message the dreamer might have to deliver. All at once the head turned sharply in my direction, and the eyes fell open, causing me to stare in blank amazement at what I beheld. The man who had been Joe Slater, the Catskill decadent, was gazing at me with a pair of luminous, expanding eyes whose blue seemed subtly to have deepened. Neither mania nor degeneracy was visible in that gaze, and I felt beyond a doubt that I was viewing a face behind which lay an active mind of high order. At this juncture my brain became aware of a steady external influence operating upon it. I closed my eyes to concentrate my thoughts more profoundly, and was rewarded by the positive knowledge that my long-sought mental message had come at last. Each transmitted idea formed rapidly in my mind, and though no actual language was employed, my habitual association of conception and expression was so great that I seemed to be receiving the message in ordinary English. Joe Slater is dead, came the soul-petrifying voice of an agency from beyond the wall of sleep. My opened eyes sought the couch of pain in curious horror, but the blue eyes were still calmly gazing, and the countenance was still intelligently animated. He is better dead, for he was unfit to bear the active intellect of cosmic entity. His gross body could not undergo the needed adjustments between ethereal life and planet life. He was too much an animal, too little a man. Yet it is through his deficiency that you have come to discover me. For the cosmic and planet souls rightly should never meet. He has been my torment and diurnal prison for 42 of your terrestrial years. I am an entity like that which you yourself become in the freedom of dreamless sleep. I am your brother of light, and have floated with you in the effulgent valleys. It is not permitted me to tell your waking earth self of your real self, but we are all roamers of vast spaces and travellers in many ages. Next year I may be dwelling in the Egypt which you call ancient, or in the cruel empire of San Chan, which is to become 3,000 years hence. You and I have drifted to the worlds that reel about the red Arcturus, and dwelt in the bodies of the insect philosophers that crawl proudly over the fourth moon of Jupiter. How little does the earth's self know life and its extent! How little indeed ought it to know for its own tranquillity! Of the oppressor I cannot speak. You on earth have unwittingly felt its distant presence. You, without knowing idly, gave the blinking beacon the name of Algol, the demon star. It is to meet and conquer the oppressor that I have vainly striven for eons, held back by bodily encumbrances. Tonight I go as a nemesis, bearing just and blazingly cataclysmic vengeance. Watch me in the sky, close by the demon star. I cannot speak longer, for the body of Joe Slater grows cold and rigid, and the coarse brains are ceasing to vibrate as I wish. You have been my only friend on this planet, the only soul to sense and seek for me within the repellent form which lies on this couch. We shall meet again, perhaps in the shining mists of Orion's sword, perhaps on a bleak plateau in prehistoric Asia, perhaps in unremembered dreams tonight, perhaps in some other form, an eon hence, when the solar system shall have been swept away. At this point, the thought waves abruptly ceased. The pale eyes of the dreamer, or can I say dead man, commenced to glaze fishily. In a half-stupor I crossed over to the couch and felt of his wrist, but found it cold, stiff, and pulseless. The sallow cheeks paled again, and the thick lips fell open, disclosing the repulsively rotten fangs of the degenerate Joe Slater. I shivered, pulled a blanket over the hideous face, and awakened the nurse. Then I left the cell and went silently to my room. I had an instant and unaccountable craving for a sleep whose dreams I should not remember. The climax? What plain tale of science can boast of such rhetorical effect? I have merely set down certain things appealing to me as facts, allowing you to construe them as you will. As I have already admitted, my superior, old Dr. Fenton, denies the reality of everything I have related. He vows that I was broken down with nervous strain and badly in need of a long vacation on full pay, which he so generously gave me. He assures me, on his professional honor, that Joe Slater was but a low-grade paranoiac, whose fantastic notions must have come from the crude hereditary folk tales which circulated in even the most decadent of communities. All this he tells me, yet I cannot forget what I saw in the sky on the night after Slater died. Lest you think me a biased witness, another pen must add this final testimony, which may perhaps supply the climax you expect. I will quote the following account of the star Nova Persei, verbatim from the pages of that eminent astronomical authority, Professor Garrett P. Service. On February 22nd, 1901, a marvellous new star was discovered by Dr. Anderson of Edinburgh, not very far from Algol. No star had been visible at that point before. Within 24 hours the stranger had become so bright that it outshone Capella. In a week or two it had visibly faded, and in the course of a few months it was hardly discernible with the naked eye. End of Beyond the Wall of Sleep. Recording by Jesse P. Watson. j.p.watson@hotmail.co.uk.
Woohoo! So there we go. It's a pretty good story. Got a little bit of work done, and getting a little bit of learning done. I've got mom's not. Mom's been really sick. My nephew's little, and he comes home for blah. He comes home, or they visit on the weekends. They stay. He stays with them, and he brings home, of course, everything from daycares and stuff. And she's been really sick lately. It's just awful. I wish I was closer. I don't like Calgary, but I loves my mommy. So hopefully she feels better soon. So I'll let you guys go. It looks like non-sex streaming still. Maybe I can't look, or else I might lock this up. So I hope you guys have a wonderful night, and we'll see you next time. Bye. Oops. 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 Bye.